All right, so we'll let people keep trickling in as we go. I'll try to keep an eye on letting people in the room. Um, but I want to thank everyone for being here, for joining us for this webinar. I apologize for the last minute Zoom link change, but I appreciate you bearing with us and showing up. We are the Learning to Listen project at the University of Maryland. And tonight we're going to be talking about some research on language and reading development for children who are deaf or hard of hearing in the school years, as well as some learning strategies that can be used or implemented at home or in the classroom. So who are we? We are a team of specialists in speech language development among children who are deaf or hard of hearing. My name is Christina Blomquist, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Maryland. We also have Juliana Gross, who's an undergraduate student here on the Zoom meeting, and she is also going to be helping present today. Our objective today is to share new research findings and answer any questions that you have about language and reading development for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. The presentation will be approximately 25 minutes, and then we'll allow for the remainder of that time for some Q&A, some questions from you. We also want to encourage you to check out our website. We have a lot of parent resources on the website where you can learn about the ongoing research activities we have and opportunities to maybe even get your family involved in our research. So today we're going to cover a few topics. So first we'll talk about phonological awareness and how it helps children learn to read and how it also develops in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. We'll also cover the topic of social skills, because that's also a really important part of getting into school and growing up in school, is developing social skills and interacting with peers. And also self-advocacy, or advocating for your child in the classroom, is also something that's really important during these years. So I'll start with phonological awareness and how it helps children learn to read. So we know that phonological awareness is a critical skill for learning to read, and we know that reading is super important for a bunch of reasons. Some of those being that it helps for developing attention and interaction skills. So not only like sustained attention of attending to reading for a period of time, but also attending to the same thing as someone else and interacting with them about that thing that you're both attending to. So reading is really important for developing those skills. It's also really important for expanding vocabulary. At a certain point in school, kids go from learning to read to reading to learn, and really they'll get all of their really advanced vocabulary and concepts from reading. So it's super important for that. And also mapping written language to concepts. So an example of that is if you go in math class and you start trying to do a word problem, you have to get through that written language and use that written language to get to the concepts and use those concepts that you know about math. So we all agree that reading is super important. So what about phonological awareness? What is it? So it's basically the awareness of sounds in spoken language and the ability to manipulate these sounds. So there are 3 levels to phonological awareness. You have syllables. So for the word book, there's that 1 syllable. Syllables have different structures, different kinds of sounds in them, consonants and vowels. You can also break those down further into having the beginnings and ends of words. So we can break down book into the beginning, b, and the end, uk. And then even further into the individual sounds themselves. So book has 3 sounds, b, and k. And so why is phonological awareness, why is this skill so important for reading? Well, it's really the foundation of reading. So it's what helps to learn that there are letters and what the different letters are and what sounds they map to. So like what sound does the letter B make? It's important for blending sounds together to read a new word. So you have some letters in front of you here for book. So being able to say, okay, B is B, and then K, and putting them all together and blending them, basically decoding that word. And also it's helpful for when you want to move past decoding every single word. The more you decode a certain word, the more familiar you become with it, the better you can just map that word itself and what you see on the page, those letters, to the concept without having to go through that tedious decoding process. So all of these skills are really foundational to reading and rely on phonological awareness. And we know that problems with phonological awareness have been identified as one of the major causes of reading difficulties. So how does phonological awareness develop in children with cochlear implants or who are deaf or hard of hearing? So in this study, There were kindergartners that had CIs who all received early identification and intervention, and they were compared to peers with typical hearing. The children completed tasks that were looking at phonological awareness, along with reading skills and spoken language skills. And to kind of dig into what it means to assess phonological awareness, so they did a few different things. They asked questions like, how many syllables are in the word apple? So that's syllable counting. They also asked questions like, are the first sound in cat and shoe the same or different? So that's really focusing on the first sound of a word, initial consonants, as we could call them. And then also which word ends with the same sound as in back. So is it face or duck? So looking at that k sound at the end. So that's really the hardest skill that they looked at, which is looking at or listening for that final consonant. So here's what they found. So they found that children with CIs had more difficulty with reading and language and phonological awareness, but they did have some relative strengths. So this is looking at those three kind of phonological awareness skills that I just mentioned. So if we look at the syllable counting or how many syllables are in a word, children with CIs have a relative strength there. Even though there might be a slight difference here on the graph, they really generally perform pretty similar to their peers with typical hearing in this kind of task. When we look at initial consonants, it's a little bit harder, focusing on that first sound of the word. They did struggle a little bit more. You see some difference between those two bars on the bar graph. And then when we get to the hardest skill, which is looking at the end or listening for the ends of words, which are actually particularly hard to hear in general, children with CIs who have particular difficulty with that kind of skill. So why might this be? Why would it be harder to develop these phonological awareness skills, especially the ones that focus on those individual speech sounds? Why would those be hard to achieve with CIs? So we think that this mainly is because CIs are not able to transmit all of the acoustic detail in the original speech that we hear. And this detail in the acoustic signal is really important for learning speech sounds and how they sound different. So kind of just dig more into that. So I have a diagram of the ear here. You can see that part of the inner ear, the snail-looking thing, the cochlea. And so here's another visual of the cochlea. And so you can see that has all these little hair cells, and they kind of work like a piano, where at one end, the hair cells respond to low notes or pitches, and then at the other end, they respond to high, and then you have all the ones in between. And you can see there are many, many, many hair cells. And then also I visualized here what an electrode might look like in the cochlea. And here you can see the blue shapes are showing the number of electrodes on that for that cochlear implant, the number of channels on that electrode. And so if we kind of use the piano analogy, it's kind of like this, where you're going to have less keys, or you're pushing more keys together at the same time. So you're just not able to get quite as much information about the notes or pitches in what you're hearing. So for another analogy, if we have, it's kind of like pixelating a picture. So here I'll play a word, a clear word. Tower. I'm not sure if you guys could hear that, but it's the word tower. And then tower, we're just pixelating that, and it sounds a little bit harder to hear, kind of robotic. So to dig more into that study that I just talked about, so we know that children with CIs have that particular difficulty with the phonological awareness skills that rely on identifying those single individual sounds and words. But like I said, they do have relative strengths in reading and language. So like I said, syllable awareness is a relative strength, as well as other language skills like storytelling. And this study found that the children with CIs will use those strengths more to help them to learn to read. So they use syllable awareness more to learn to read than their peers with typical hearing. And this is just showing that children with CIs, they learn to adapt and use their strengths when they're learning these higher level of reading and language skills, which is great. Another finding related to phonological awareness is looking at, like, longitudinally how these skills develop from 2nd to 6th grade. So in this study, they had children with CIs who were assessed in 2nd grade on various language skills, and then again in 6th grade on different language skills. So they really looked at phonological awareness, vocabulary, grammar, and reading. So what they found was that, I'll just show all those 4 different measures that I mentioned. So they found similar rates of growth. So the difference between those 2 time points, second and sixth grade, the difference is pretty similar between groups, but when you see the gap between the lines, that's showing like overall performance across that time can have a difference between groups. You can see the relative strength here is in grammar, right? So there really was not much of a difference between these 2 lines for these kids that were in this study for grammar skills. When we look at reading and vocabulary, there is a difference there, which kind of goes along with what we typically see with maybe a slight delay or at risk of a little bit of a delay in these skills. And then when we look at phonological awareness, we maybe see a particularly bigger gap because of that known difficulty with hearing those specific speech sounds because of how the CI works. So even though they may show a similar rate of growth across this time, they do have more need to grow here because they have particular difficulty with this. Another thing that this study found was they were looking at how learning to read helps you with other skills. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, learning to read can help with other skills like expanding vocabulary. And for the kids with CIs, they found that not only did it help the children with CIs learn, not only did reading practice help to learn new words, but also to learn sounds a little bit better and work with sounds better phonologically. And so this is kind of a sign that that visual language input that you get with reading and mapping something visual to something that you're hearing can actually help you learn to manipulate sounds like with phonological awareness a little bit better, as well as learning new words. So not only is this skill helpful, phonological awareness helpful for learning to read, but it kind of works in the other direction as well. So what are some things that you can do at home to work on phonological awareness and reading? So just some everyday things that you can think about, talking about sounds and words just in general. And this can be in a game, for example. So if you're playing something like I Spy, you could do something like describing what a word sounds like for that particular object. So I spy something red, just typical I Spy, but that starts with the sound P. So maybe in this picture, that could be something like a pencil sharpener. Another example would be I spy something that rhymes with sock. So for this picture, that would probably be clock. So just a different way of doing I Spy. It's pointing out that words sound different or can sound the same. You can also practice combining words and syllables together or breaking them down. One example of this and kind of an everyday activity would be something called syllable shopping. So you're at grocery shopping and you're picking out different things to get to put in the cart. And maybe every time you go to put something in the cart or the basket, you try to break down the word into the number of syllables. So if you're grabbing for a tomato, you could say, how many syllables are there in tomato? And one way to help your child with this is to kind of clap out the syllables. So like tomato, and counting those out is helpful for that skill. Another thing, like I mentioned, is book reading. You can do a lot of things during book reading to help with phonological awareness, like talking about the words on the page and what they sound like. So for example, if you're reading a book, you can point out, even before you say anything on the page, you could say, what is this letter? If it's letter B, what does that sound like? What is this? So what sound does this word start with? So instead of just talking about the words that are on the page, just saying the words that are on the page, actually talking about them and how they sound. So shared book reading or book reading in general is awesome. Book reading is better than no book reading, right? And in our past webinars, we've really mentioned how important reading is in general. But if you want to kind of bring your reading up to the next level with your child, there are some things that you can do, some strategies. So one thing is starting a back and forth with your child. So rather than just reading to your child, you can be reading with your child. So one way to do this is asking open-ended questions like, how do you think the character is feeling right now? Or repeat and expand what they said. So maybe if they answered, she's sad, you could say, yes, she is probably sad and upset because her cat is missing. So you're adding to it, you're making a more complex or sophisticated sentence, kind of adding meaning to that sentence. And also just remembering to provide feedback and positive reinforcement for something that they're learning. That's always helpful to build their confidence so they're willing to try again on the next time you ask a question. Another thing that you can think about with leveling up your reading with your child is talking beyond the text. So encouraging your child to talk about things that aren't on the page, like predicting. So what do you think the character will do next? Making inferences. What do you like? Why do you think that character might have acted that way? Explaining their own viewpoint of what's going on in the story. So like, what would you do that too if it happened to you? And then also connecting the story to real life. Do you remember how you felt when this thing happened that's related? And then the last thing I'll talk about with strategy for book reading is pointing to words. So kind of getting back to phonological awareness as well. So pointing out the forms, functions, and characteristics of print or words on a page. So one really easy thing to try is tracking the text with your finger while you're reading. Even if they're not paying attention to, the text all the time when you're pointing to it, it can be helpful if they just happen to be looking at what you're pointing at, of mapping what you're saying to what they see on the page. Another thing to think about is pointing out environmental print. So what this means is just like if there's print or words on the page that aren't something that you would read to tell the story. So like if you're talking about a story at school and there's a sign on the picture that says school, just pointing out, oh, that's a sign that says school and why that might be. You can also talk about letters, like how they can be big or small, or counting a specific letter and how many times it is on the page. And talking about words, like how they can be long or short, or they can be made up of letters, like how many letters they have. And you can also have children find words on a page if they happen to know what a word looks like. So just to show a few examples of that, so I just have a children's book here. I'll give a few examples of what you could say. So you could point out the pig's name and the letters in it and say that is the pig's name. Freddie, can you find this word anywhere else on the page? So even though a child may not be able to actually read that word, maybe they could still see what it looks like and find another example of it on that page. You can also point out the print that's elsewhere on the page. So this is help in red and bold text. You could ask them maybe what this says or why it's so big or why it's red. You can also ask something like, what do you think the frog is thinking or feeling? You have some hints here that maybe the frog is kind of scared or something like that. And then before you even turn the next page, asking what you think might happen next. So I just talked a lot about reading and phonological awareness, but like I mentioned, we also want to talk about social skills today and some research findings that are more recent about this. So I'm going to hand over to Juliana to talk a little bit about what we know here.
All right. So another large aspect of school for children is the social aspect. Suddenly, your child will be having a lot of new speaking partners and having to navigate new social interactions with non-family members. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing often have an additional challenge of navigating these new relationships without full auditory access. But few interventions target the social aspect of language and how children who are deaf or hard of hearing develop social skills. Recent research, next slide, suggests that children with CIs may have similar struggles with their social skills, similar to the struggles that they may have with their oral language. A study done by Hoffman and his team in 2016 enrolled around 200 children in a longitudinal study, meaning that they studied them over a long period of time. And they had 132 children with CIs and 67 with typical hearing. They used parent surveys to track their child's level of social competence over the course of 5 years. But what exactly is social competence and how is it measured? A child's social competence, in this case, refers to their ability to interact effectively with those in their environment, including peers, family members, and other adults. It was measured in this experiment using standardized parent questionnaires, some made for all children and some tailored for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. These looked at various social skills, such as how often a child would act in a flexible or adaptive way, or use pro-social behavior. Items on the surveys included statements like adjusts well to teachers or encourages others to do their best. And parents had to rate how well they agreed to that statement in the context of their child. The surveys also covered other social skills such as cooperation, assertion or assertiveness, self-control, and responsibility. So they had parents do these surveys throughout the year for 5 years and compared the results for children with CIs and children with typical hearing in terms of both social competence and oral language skills. Well, they found a significant gap in social competence between the two groups during this study. In this graph, social competence is measured on the vertical axis, and the time since CI implantation is measured on the horizontal axis. Even 8 years after implantation, the children with CIs had consistently lower social competency scores compared to age-matched hearing peers. There could be many explanations for this gap, although little research has been done about the potential causes. Maybe speech and language struggles lead to lack of practice with these measured social skills. Interestingly, these children were also tested on oral language skills, and while their oral language skills increased over this time period with intervention, their social competency scores stayed more or less the same. This suggests that children who are deaf or hard of hearing may benefit from speech and language interventions that also target these social language skills. What could be some of these potential causes of this difficulty with social skills? A few studies have been done on this topic, and I'm going to go into detail about 2 of them right now. The first is a study done by Dom and his team in 2019, in which they investigated whether children who are deaf or hard of hearing expressed emotion in their voices, like their peers did with typical hearing, and whether it was interpretable by others in the same way, as if a person with typical hearing said it. They had 14 school-age children with CIs record neutral sentences like "the bus is here" in what they considered to be happy, neutral, and sad tones. They had children with typical hearing record the same sentences as a control. They then had children and adults with typical hearing categorize the recordings as happy, neutral, or sad. Some of the results are graphed here, with each colored line representing a different speaker. The percent of statements that were correctly categorized by the listeners is graphed on the vertical axis, and the age of the speaker when they got their CIs is on the horizontal axis. This graph shows that the speaker had more perceptible emotions by the listeners if they were implanted earlier. So that means that the more access they had to auditory information, the longer of time that they had access to that, the easier it was for them to express emotion in their voice in the same way that as children with typical hearing do. Overall, the children with CIs in this study produced fewer recognizable emotions than their peers with typical hearing, as rated by the listeners with typical hearing. The next study, done by Church and his team in 2017, investigated conversational repair between children with CIs and peers with typical hearing. Conversational repair refers to when a speaking partner asks for clarification or repetition. And this study wanted to look for patterns of conversational repair in this group. The study recorded 10 conversations between children with CIs and children with typical hearing and picked out instances of conversational repair. The researchers found that children with typical hearing asked for repair more, and children with CIs repaired their own speech more often than children with typical hearing did. But the most interesting finding from this study was that children with CIs asked for clarification and repetition less often than their peers with typical hearing did. The researchers suggested that even if the children with CIs miss the auditory information, they're less likely to ask for the repair due to the social pressure to fit in with their peers with typical hearing. So these 2 findings, with the emotion in the voice and conversational repair, investigate some of the possible causes for the struggle with social skill development that children with CIs tend to experience. But with more research, these causes could be identified and incorporated into interventions. Oh, I think you muted.
Yeah. Okay, so to kind of build off of what Juliana was saying, especially with the conversational repair skills, these really relate to advocating in the classroom, whether that's the child advocating for themselves or things that you can do to advocate as well. So first, I just want to talk about noise in the classroom, because this is really relevant to the classroom environment and it being accommodating to children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So this is just a review of studies for children actually with typical hearing. So these are dozens of studies that looked at classrooms with different level of chronic noise exposure. So when I say chronic noise exposure, that's like everyday, almost constant noise that is really noticeable. So that's like living or being next to an airport or having a major highway nearby, or really loud, machinery nearby. And so these studies looked at those different levels of noise exposure and compared the children and their ability to perceive speech as well as like language development and especially looking at reading comprehension skills and how those developed. And so what they found was that the noise exposure, or the noise in the background in classrooms, was definitely impeding children's ability to hear their teacher, which did directly impact reading and their ability to learn to read. In addition, just having noise in the background for other reasons is also impacting children's ability to learn to read, reading outcomes. And so this could be something like focus, being able to focus with that noise in the background, or things like that that can impact children's learning in the classroom. To kind of tie this to what we know for children who are deaf or hard of hearing, this study looked at 3 groups of kindergartners: those who had typical hearing, those who used hearing aids, and those who used CIs. And they tested them on recognizing speech in different levels of noise. So this is what the results looked like. So you have their speech recognition performance on the vertical axis, and then the level of noise that they were dealing with on the bottom axis. And so they had a situation that was in quiet with no noise. They had a situation where there was background noise. So it wasn't louder than what they were trying to listen to, the speech, but it was still there. And then they had loud noise that was really actually louder than what they were trying to listen to. And you can see that all children experienced difficulty when there was noise added, and that's pretty stark difference. You can also see that there are children with CIs and hearing aids, because they generally have a little bit more difficulty recognizing speech in general. This means that when you add noise, they have even more trouble. You can see that by that difference between the blue line and the orange and gray line. So what this means is that in noisy listening situations, like a noisy classroom, children who are deaf or hard of hearing are at risk of falling further behind in language and reading. So it's really important to consider and to make sure that these children are accommodated in the classroom to try and reduce this noise as much as possible, and really make sure that they have access to what's going on in the classroom. So what are some ways that we can help with this? What are things that you can do? So one big thing is ensuring that the child has appropriate amplification and an appropriate listening environment for them. So this can be via an FM system that directly links to the child's hearing device. So a mic that the teacher has is going to link to their hearing device, or it can be a speaker in the classroom or a personal speaker for the child. And other ways to ensure an appropriate listening environment can be seating placement. So where the child is sitting in the classroom, whether that's away from noise sources, closer to the teacher, or closer to peers, depending on the activity. Another thing to get that can be considered in the classroom is reducing how noise travels throughout the classroom. So any hard surfaces are going to reflect a lot of noise back, which makes it even noisier and harder to hear. So ways that we can address that in the classroom is covering these hard surfaces. So for example, with a rug or wall coverings or curtains, padding, chairs and tables. One example is putting something underneath the legs of chairs and tables so that when they move, they create a little bit less noise. So all of these things can be considered to help make the listening environment better for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. You can also find out what you're entitled to in the classroom, because it can be even more than these things that I've discussed. So we have put together a bunch of resources that have to do with the available classroom accommodations that could be available to you in your state or region. And these can include things that I didn't mention, like note takers, interpreters, captions, therapy, things like that. So we'll share this on our website as well, so this can be accessible to you. And the last thing I wanted to talk about with ways that you can help your child in the classroom is teaching self-advocacy. So self-advocacy is a skill that develops just like any other skill. So it starts with easier skills, more basic skills, and then we build on those. So in kindergarten, you can even start working on self-advocacy. So one thing that kindergartners can think about is the awareness of where they're sitting and how that impacts their learning. So if they sit closer to the teacher or are closer to the teacher, it's a little bit easier to hear and learn versus further away, for example. They can learn to ask for repetitions when they need them, like when they've missed a message or a detail in the classroom. And so this can include just asking for repetition, raising their hand and asking to hear that again, or even giving some instruction maybe on how it could be easier to hear. So speaking more slowly or clearly or louder. Moving into first grade, this can include, their skills can include recognizing the effect of noise on their learning and acting on that. So if they hear noise from the hallway and that's impacting their ability to hear and learn, they could either close the door or ask for the door to be closed. They can also kind of develop, collaborate with the teacher to come up with a signal that they can use to indicate that they're having challenges with listening and understanding. This is an important point too of like in self-advocacy, it's not just the parent that can get involved, but especially the teacher has to be involved in collaborating with the child and making sure that they are in the best environment for learning and that they're doing what they can. Moving into grade 2, the child can learn to not only use the FM system, but also be able to describe it and describe the purpose to either a teacher or a student or anybody else, and describe the importance of it to them. They can also begin to learn doing basic troubleshooting of their hearing device and the malfunctions that can happen. So needing to change batteries, for example, or maybe the magnet's not sticking for some reason and the CI is falling off. So any kind of basic troubleshooting. In grade 3, they can identify challenging listening situations themselves in school. So identifying that maybe at lunch it's particularly hard to hear, and just identifying that, then you can move towards finding a solution to make that a little bit easier. Or maybe gym is a particularly hard time to hear the teacher, and that would make sense because it's a larger room with lots of hard surfaces, so there's a lot of reverberation and noise going on there. They can also identify the source of listening difficulty at this level. So if they have some kind of misunderstanding or some difficulty with hearing, they can identify whether that's the speaker maybe needing to speak up, or maybe they said something not quite right that they didn't mean, or it's the listener needing to get closer to the speaker or just hear repetition, or something in the environment, like there's some noise in the background that can be dealt with. So just to describe all these as examples of things that children can work on along with anything else they're working on in the classroom, just to help themselves ensure and gain confidence in their ability to learn. And this self-advocacy is not just important for in school, but also, of course, in other situations where children are communicating. And this really helps to build confidence that they have control over their ability to communicate. All right, so we've kind of gone over everything that we wanted to in our 3 major topics. So at this point, I just want to open up to everybody here if they have a question about anything that we've talked about or something that we haven't covered. We'd love to hear your questions and answer them as best we can. So I'll move into some things that we've come up with as like frequently asked questions that we get. But if you do have any questions that come up, feel free to interrupt me and let me know. Okay, so for anyone who's been at multiple webinars, we have gone over these before, so I apologize if this is repetitive. But one question that we get often is from families who speak multiple languages at home. And so they may kind of wonder, like, should I only use one language with my child? Or is it okay to use multiple languages? Which one should I use? And really the answer to this is the more language you use in your home, the better. And the best languages to use are the ones that you're most comfortable in, and the ones that you can use in a variety of ways. So that can include things like speaking or singing, reading, like we've talked about. And these different contexts could differ for what language is best in those, depending on which ones you're most comfortable with in that context. And so one concern that comes up and why parents really ask this question is sometimes it's been seen that multilingual children can take longer to reach some speech language milestones. And if we think about it, that may kind of make sense because if you think about how much language input a child is getting and in what language, where a monolingual child is getting all of their input, all of this input in one language, a multilingual child is getting this maybe the same amount of input, but then half of that in one and half of that in the other language. So it would make sense that it might take a little bit longer to learn from that language when you're just getting a little bit less information from each. But of course, in the end, these children do catch up. And then you also have this really valuable skill of knowing and being fluent in more than one language. So even though some multilingual children might appear to be behind early on, they do catch up and then they can use more than one language. Another question that we'll get is, what is the difference between American Sign Language and home sign or baby sign? So American Sign Language is a full language with its own grammatical rules. And some of these rules are different than English. So American Sign Language is not just signed English, it's its own language in its own right. So children with hearing loss who are born to hearing parents lack access to a usable language model if their parents only use spoken language. If the child can access that spoken language, then they're not able to get that access to language in general. So they have the skills to learn language, but just no language to learn. And in these cases, children and their families can adopt home sign systems to try and communicate before children can access that spoken language. And these can be family-specific sign systems that can develop from a child using a home sign that derives from maybe a co-speech gesture, so some gesture that goes with drinking perhaps, or eating, and just these gestures that parents use when they speak orally. But it's important to note that home sign is not a complete linguistic system the way that ASL is. It cannot replace ASL. So by developing a home sign or baby sign system, a child may be missing out on some of the grammatical components that they would be learning in ASL, which are the equivalent of an oral language. So another question that can come up is whether it will hurt a child's development if they sign with them before or after intervention. So there are a lot of opinions on this, and this decision really at the end of the day should be made in consultation with healthcare providers and families. And that includes the audiologist and speech language pathologist. And just here's what you should know. So remembering the difference between ASL and home sign, and that the better signer you are, the more your child can learn from you. In addition, it's been shown that children with cochlear implants who learn ASL from fluent ASL signers reach the same speech language milestones as hearing children who learn ASL and oral language. And this includes all aspects of language, so articulation, vocabulary, pre-literacy skills, and the ability to combine words or grammar. And it's important to be careful when looking at research about this. So for example, this study here was looking at two different groups, one that was using sign and one that wasn't. And you can see that their spoken language score that they measured is different. But it's important to note that in this study, one group is actually monolingual or just using one language, which is spoken language, and the other is using two. They're bimodal, bilingual in a way. And so remembering what we talked about, that we can treat ASL and spoken language kind of the same way we talked about multiple languages in the home. Even though they might be behind at first in spoken language or in ASL at the same time, they will eventually catch up because we know that that's how bilingual children develop language. And they may take longer to learn more, just like any other child who's learning more than one language. And for bimodal bicultural kids who use ASL and oral language, is also access to a whole community and culture via ASL. A question that's super relevant right now and for the past few years has been whether masks impede children's speech language development, because we know anecdotally that kids who are deaf or hard of hearing tend to find it really helpful to have those cues from the face and lip reading and things like that. But what's been found is that children adapt to make use of all the kinds of gestures, kinds of cues that they can use to learn speech and language. So they have more than just lip reading or seeing the mouth while someone's talking, but also gestures that people use and pitch in someone's voice can tell you a lot about the speech and language that they're using. So for children who rely on visual cues, The transition to not using them may take some time, of course, but we know that children are highly adaptive language learners and can learn to rely on different cues. And so we know that children who are blind develop language just like children who are sighted. So visual cues are not required to learn speech and language, although some children do find them helpful when they're available.
Oh, Christina, I think there's a question in the chat, and it's
Okay.
related to this question.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So the question is, should we limit screen time since deaf or hard of hearing kids may mostly lean on cues and visual aids in an environment when there's no proper audio output appropriate to their needs? Okay, so yeah, so screen time can be valuable in some ways, but it's true that the cues that deaf or hard of hearing kids rely on may not be available in that context from screen time. So anything that they could potentially learn from that is limited by things not being available to them. But it's also important to note that in order to learn from anything, children need a really rich social interaction to learn language. And so in general, screen time really can't do this via like a TV or YouTube program because it's really just one way. And so there has been research on this. So this study that I'm about to talk about had infants who are English learning infants. They listened to stories in either English or Mandarin. And those who listened in Mandarin did learn Mandarin sounds. So they listened to stories in person with someone interacting with them. And these children did learn the sounds of this other language over a very short period of time. They also looked at if infants could learn via audio or audio-visual experience. So they were listening to Mandarin either with just audio or with a visual as well from the screen. And they found that neither group, either the audio or audiovisual group, were able to show any evidence of learning Mandarin sounds, even with the experience that the same amount of experience that the other group had, the live interaction group had. And so this really shows that language learning via screen time is not as rich and as fast or possible a lot of the time as just live social interaction. And so that is one reason why it's important to try and limit screen time. Of course, it's not, screen time can be really helpful for time management and just like getting a break. So that totally makes sense. But it's just something to keep in mind in your everyday. And kind of like we talked about as well with noise, it's important to think about the fact that having something on a screen on in the background is also just added background noise. And so it really applies to the things that I was talking about in the classroom environment too. In the home, it's just harder to understand with that background noise. And if you're trying to do something like learning, like even doing homework, it can just make it harder to get what you need to get done. So please feel free to ask any questions right now if you have any. And also afterwards, if you have come up with questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. So this is our email as well as our phone number. You can also find out about research opportunities at the University Learning to Listen project at our website here, where we also have a bunch of resources that you might find helpful. Right now, we're currently recruiting children with CIs who are between the ages of 2 and 13. And then again, here's our team. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining us today and for listening. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
There's another question in the chat.
Okay, I'm bad at monitoring the chat. Okay. Did the kids with CIs have unilateral or bilateral implants? That's a really good question. So I can't give specifics off the top of my head for the studies that I've covered today. I think typically it's been a mix. I can say that there has been some question of like maybe kids with bilateral implants do better. And there's some evidence for that. But really what one of the studies that I talked about found was that if kids have early access to bimodal input, so maybe they get one implant and then they have a hearing aid for a while before they get their second implant, that's actually really impactful for long-term outcomes in speech and language. So that's something to keep in mind. As far as unilateral versus bilateral, I don't know if Margaret, you have something else to add to that, but there's some additional benefits to bilateral, definitely.
Right. And for sure, we know that it helps with listening and noise and
Right,
distance.
right, right.
Right. I just want to make a comment. After our last session, we were able to have a little more discussion about some research that looked at children's speech production when they're learning spoken language only versus maybe in a total communication setting where they're signing and speaking. And that although their language in both languages grow, there's some evidence to support that children in a spoken language setting will have clearer speech production outcomes. You know, if you
Yeah.
wanted to speak more to that or.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, Margaret, is it okay if I ask like a sort of a follow-up question about my question? Because
Yes.
I don't know if you and I ever discussed this, Margaret, but I would think that especially when it comes to social skills, that unilateral versus bilateral would make a difference. You know, I can't say I ever saw any research to back that up, but many years ago, I remember someone wrote this really nice post, and you know, this was back in the days of Yahoo groups, and saying how, you know, when her child got one implant, it helped them with, you know, develop spoken language, and when they got their second implant, it helped them socially. And you know, I actually did have a conversation about this on and off with my son, who's actually now 14, because he did stop wearing an implant on his left ear for a while. He actually did just start wearing it again after he went back to the went to the audiologist last Monday. But in any case, there was recently, I don't know if anyone here follows, it's a good resource, Hearing Health Matters. There's a lot of different professionals have blogs on there, but one of them is Jane Maydell, who, you know, has really been a pioneer in deaf and hard of hearing children developing listening and spoken language. I used to live in New York, so I actually had the opportunity to learn from her in person. She actually wrote about a whole article about one of her articles back, I think it was in March or April, was about it, where she said, you know, we have to look at psychological versus psychosocial development. And, you know, they say that one side of the brain impacts one more than the other. So maybe we should implant that this one ear first because of that. I just found it very interesting. Because I mean, I would think with social skills, it could make a difference. I mean, I actually pointed that out to my son a few times. I'm like, I would say, if you were wearing 2 implants, you wouldn't have missed that.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of to tie into what Margaret was saying about how it's helpful for listening and noise and distance.
Yeah.
And knowing if someone's talking on one side versus the other side of you.
Exactly.
Think about how helpful those skills are in general, like in a classroom or just any social setting, knowing where someone's speaking from or being able to hear them better in a noisy environment. So just for those reasons, you can imagine it would be helpful for developing social skills and confidence as well in those situations. I can't speak to the side of the brain argument. I haven't seen anything on that. But yeah, that's a really important question. Like we were talking about, like we really need to think about social and psychosocial development for these kids as well.
I think I saw one more note in the chat, but it flashed on, flashed off. Does anybody else see that?
I see it. Yes. Okay. My son is going to first grade and having an incredibly hard time with sounds of letters. Is there a visual way to help him? Yes. So one thing that I find helpful is linking. So letters themselves don't tell you how to say a sound, right? They don't really look like anything. They're just kind of arbitrary shapes. But it can be helpful to link something visual to that sound. Maybe for the S sound, it kind of looks like a snake. So it makes a snake sound. And you can add different kinds of cues as well that way. But just it's like we were talking about with reading, and that visual helping to link to speech sounds can be helpful. Coming up with something that's a little bit more meaningful about how you produce something and linking that to the letter, that can be helpful. I don't know if Margaret, you have anything to add?
Yeah, and there's some formal programs that do that. They'll have like a little cartoon character made into the shape of the letter, and just like you said, the sound attached to it. So if she wants to email me at margaret@asoundbeginning.org, I'd be happy to look at one of those programs for her.
These are all really great questions. I know we're getting close to 8 o'clock. So I'm happy to field any more questions that anyone has. But also, again, if you come up with any afterwards, feel free to contact us.
I think there was one more in the chat.
Oh, I just saw that too. Okay. Oh, okay. Margaret's also sending her email as well. Okay, any new technologies you might have heard about or getting excited about, what you have researched about or followed in the CI space? Any new technologies? Let me think about that for a second. Margaret, do you have anything off the top of your head as far as technologies or maybe processing strategies that have come out?
We just had a big conference a couple weeks ago, and Meta is still talking about their longer array and covering more of the cochlea. Other than that, they've really all improved their waterproofing and their ear level processors and off the ear processors. So just continuing to make little changes. I haven't heard of anything else that's really earth shattering. I think in terms of FM systems, there hasn't, the newest thing with FMs is having them built right in. I think it's in the cochlear that now it can be built right in and you don't need a boot to put on. That's pretty new.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really a nice thing for children to be able to go to school and not have to have that somebody coming in and helping with their boot.
Yeah, those are great points. We had another question. In public school environment, what criteria could you use to influence the selection of a teacher for a CI kid? We all love to have someone with special education background. What else would you consider? This question really makes me just think of kind of what we know with therapy in general, that the best outcomes in therapy come from the connection between the child and the therapist. And so really just someone who clicks with your child is really the best part. I know that's really hard to come up with, to know about someone before you meet them. But sometimes, I mean, having special education background, of course, is helpful. And then someone who has any background in hearing technologies can also know a little bit more about how the accommodations work. Like I said, it's helpful for the child to be able to advocate for themselves, but when children are younger, they may not be able to do that as much. So making sure that those things are on and working and consistent. It's helpful if teachers have some knowledge of that. Margaret, do you have suggestions for that as well?
I would just encourage too that the deaf and hard of hearing teacher most likely is providing some in-servicing for the staff. So no matter what teacher you do get, they may not have worked with a child with hearing loss in the past, but they should be getting an in-service early on. And then I would be checking in with that teacher and asking them how comfortable they are working with your child. They're going to say fine, but ask for some examples and try to probe that, and then try to encourage the team to provide the support that that teacher might need. I've seen in-services even in January, February, because people read the IEP, but they didn't really implement what they were supposed to do, and you need to revisit that.
Yeah, that's a great point about getting the school audiologist or deaf or hard of hearing teacher involved, because teachers have a lot on their plate, and so it's always helpful to kind of remind them and help them out to stay on top of what your child needs. Thanks, Sarah, for sharing that article in the chat.
I just want to take a second, if I can, to thank some of our board members who joined the call this evening. It's been really nice to see. We have Parto on with us, and we have Ravi here, and we have Sarah here. So I wanted to say thank you to our board members for supporting this program, and thank you to all of you at the Learning to Listen Lab for sharing these talks with us this summer. It's been a really beneficial program, and we look forward to continuing working with you.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. And yeah, we look forward to continuing to work with you. And we love having this partnership with you to get to talk with parents more, especially. All right. Thank you so much for coming, you guys. I think we're out of time. But feel free to reach out to us or Margaret about anything that we've talked about. And yeah, maybe we'll see you again in another webinar. Who knows?
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too.